first, I want to thank David Banks for moderating the panel. As many of you will have known, Dave has recently come out of the White House from an energy policy perspective, but also just has an entire government career in being a leader in energy tech. So thank you, David, for being here. Dan Reicher from Stanford, who leads energy policy there and energy policy and finance, and just has a fantastic history of experience of thought leadership at Stanford and in government. Again, I think 3 presidents have listened to your advice on energy policy, so fantastic. Todd Wetzel, we thought it'd be fantastic to have a large corporate perspective, and really Todd is the energy tech thought leader at GE and runs within their global research department pretty much the energy research that's come out of every one of the technologies that we've been talking about for the past 2 days. And Taite McDonald, fantastic to have you here, partner at Holland and Knight. And again, Taite has been intimately involved with pretty much every single energy-related government agency and department in policy development and regulatory frameworks in the energy space. So kind of an eclectic group, but part of what we're trying to do here really to talk about the various elements and to give you, the innovator, a bigger picture of some of what is happening across the space. So thank you again, and I'll turn it over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Jay. Appreciate it. The energy innovation agenda is obviously incredibly important. And, I think that at least from the Trump administration's perspective, it's certainly a topic that comes up often. It's part of the president's vision for energy. Oftentimes when you hear this phrase, energy dominance, the innovation technology agenda is part of that. Putting aside, some of these budget issues, which I think is probably another kind of conversation we can have, but given where the president is on the budget, but where we ended up, after the Hill weighed in, I think we're in a really good place to sort of move forward and think about what the priorities are on the innovation energy front. I'd like to say just one quick thing about the role of technology in energy policy making, the actual sort of, what happens when the White House convenes a meeting on an energy policy issue. Typically, and at least when I was there, we made it a point to always include the technology discussion because you can't, in my opinion, you can't have a real energy policy discussion without getting into the technology. I do think it's difficult at times because it's hard to know where things are going to end up. But having those kind of scenarios is really important when you're trying to figure out what a decision point should be on any given issue. And we've done this on the nuclear front, for example. In the president's civil nuclear review, technology, innovation, R&D is one of the main tracks of that review and plays an incredibly important role when the administration is looking at what's the future of the U.S. civil nuclear program, what should the focus be, if the administration is going to, or the United States is going to develop some type of competitive advantage in a given nuclear technology, what should that be, and again, what kind of impact will that have on U.S. economic, energy, and national security? I will say that there are times when the technology piece, the innovation agenda, is not rolled in to the discussions, and I think that you're probably seeing some of that play out in some of the broader sort of electricity issues that we're discussing here, or they're discussing in D.C. But with that, why don't I turn it over to you, Dan?
So I think what we're going to do is just give you do our own brief introductions, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah.
Good. So I'm Dan Reicher. I've been in the energy world for a long time. I started running the photocopy machine on the President's Commission on the accident at 3 Mile Island. I was a young kid, and that was my first energy job. More seriously, under President Clinton, I was the Assistant Secretary of Energy for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, one of the big applied offices at DOE. Went from there to a wind technology company, and then from there set up an investment firm, one of the early ones that was investing in small clean energy projects. Then I had the chance to go to Google, help Google set up its programs in energy technology, policy, and finance. Was there for 4 years, and then went over to Stanford. I'm at the business school and the law school, where we've set up a joint center on energy policy and finance. Look forward to talking to my panelists and all of you.
It's terrific.
Thanks, Dan. So my name is Todd Wetzel. I work at GE Global Research, just up the road a couple hours from here. I've spent my whole professional career in GE, about 20 years, all at the research center. Initially as a researcher. For many years, I led a couple of our different research teams around heat transfer, fluid dynamics, that kind of thing. And for the last couple of years, I've had the responsibility of overseeing all of our power research at the research center. So I'm a liaison between our research center and our power business, but also expected to kind of be smart about the whole landscape of energy technology and be one of the agents within the company to agitate and try to disrupt our company. You know, GE's got a very long and proud history in the energy space. You know, we have big, huge pictures of Thomas Edison on our wall at the research center and quotes plastered all over the place. And we really love tapping into that legacy as a way of inspiring our research staff for what our role in the world is. And you know, today, if you just stand back and look at the planet Earth, a third of all the electrons being generated at any given time are being generated by GE equipment. So, you know, what I've enjoyed about my time at the Research Center and with GE is in a big company like that, you know, Jay introduced me as the big corporate guy, right? So in a big energy company like that, we talk about planet Earth. We talk about the entire ecosystem on the planet and what kind of technologies and solutions Earth needs. And while we are quite prideful of that installed base that is turning the lights on in, you know, people's houses all around the world, we also have lived long enough to have seen that whole energy ecosystem change many times over the last 100 and some odd years. And we all know we're under a big transformation right now, and so it's pretty exciting time to be in a research center for one of the biggest energy companies in the world while that whole ecosystem is going through a massive amount of technological change. So events like this are a pretty fun thing to come and participate in, mainly to learn, but also to help tell a little bit of the GE story. So, Tate?
Thanks, Todd. It's a tough act to follow. Goodness. So yes, as Dave and Jay have said, my name's Taite McDonald. I'm a partner at Holland & Knight. I am a lawyer, but I am a very unique lawyer. And of course, a lot of you heard this last night. But so I've spent my whole career specializing in mostly executive branch programs like ARPA-E and energy technology commercialization. That has now led to a lot of policy work because after 10 to 15 years, I've learned a lot, I've seen a lot, and I've learned a lot. So that's turned into a lot of policy work as well today. And why I'm actually here today, so I've worked with ARPA-E throughout the years. I've done a number of grants and commercialization strategies for what are now household names, which weren't when I worked on them, like Tesla, an acquisition that Google did from ARPA-E actually called Makani Wind, Sunrun. I did a lot of Sunrun's early work, and a lot of other DOE-grown technologies that are in the midst of commercialization. But I've also worked on with a lot of really, really good technology that didn't make it to commercialization. So that's really my role. That's what I spend every day doing. It's what gets me excited in the morning. It's what I get up to do, is help companies like the companies in this room ensure that they can commercialize their technology. And we're going to have a little bit more general of a policy discussion, but I'll say one thing before I turn it over that's really important for the folks in the room and essentially why I got asked to pull this panel together, help pull this panel together today. And it's really, I've seen so much good technology work and a lot of technology that you wouldn't expect to. end up be commercialized. And a lot of companies that you wouldn't expect to make it end up commercializing. And really what the difference is that's really important for everyone in this room to take away is it is the team and it is the strategy. So you can have the best technology in the world, but you aren't going to have a success story if you can't build the team appropriately and build the strategy appropriately. And that includes what market to chase after, and this is a natural segue to our broader conversation. In energy, you can't decouple energy and regulation and policy. And so when developing your strategy, you really have to be aware of what's going on in Washington and the state level, where the opportunities are and where you're going to have bottlenecks associated with regulation and policy, and how to build strategies around that. So with that, I'll turn it back, but
Thanks, Tate.
I think we'll have an interesting discussion.
Yeah, so we want to have as much of a conversation as possible, and hopefully, so we haven't orchestrated it, so hopefully it will actually be coherent and interesting at the same time, right?
We all talk a lot, so.
But that's right. So, question I'd like to pose to the group here is, what are you most excited about when it comes to the interplay of energy, tech, reg, all that sort of policy? Tate?
Oh, I'm going first? Okay.
Yeah.
So what I am most excited about that is the opportunity that the companies in the room have right now from a policy and market perspective, combined. So I know I haven't seen all the discussions, but I've heard a lot about, and obviously I see in the market every day, the costs of energy technology coming down dramatically. Those costs in combination with the costs coming down in combination with global market opportunity. In the one thing I will say, and I was glad to hear others have started saying this. I had a meeting with the foundation this morning, and the woman said, and I was like, yes. But the one thing that I see really happening is as much as there was some uncertainty in the energy industry with the transition of the Trump administration, and there have been some things that Dave fought for that didn't move forward, which I'm sure we'll get into. There is what has happened with the budgets that we got last year, in combination with a lot of good work being done on Capitol Hill on both sides of the aisle. And in addition to that, there's been a lot of local governments and mayors stepping up to address energy policy solutions and drive energy commercialization forward. So the combination of federal, local, state level, all moving forward in combination with technology maturing and prices coming down, makes this market more interesting than at any point in my career.
You know, the way I always look at it, of course, I'm a technology guy, right? So all my answers are going to be about different technologies. And there's no shortage of really neat technologies going on. We're learning about a lot of them over this two-day event, and GE works on just about every form of energy technology. But if I had to pick a couple that are really exciting to me right now, of course, energy storage. We've heard that a million times today, but energy storage is very fascinating, and how that's going to interplay with all different types of generators, not just solar and wind, where we have a lot of interest, but with gas and sometimes people even talk with nuclear and whatnot. There's just so much interesting interplay there. That's fascinating. One other layer on that is very interesting to me personally right now is the digital angle to the whole thing. It's kind of fun. We'll bring customers, power plant operators, utilities, and whatnot into the research center for events and sit and talk with them for a couple days about technology and the future of energy. And it is really hard to run a grid. And it was hard enough to run a grid when a grid was based off of a nuclear plant that just was on all the time, a coal plant that was on all the time, and then an awesome GE gas turbine that you could cycle as you needed to kind of balance things out. But now you put out some solar that's going to make power when it wants to. Wind, it's going to make power when it wants to. You're going to put out regulatory, either at the federal level from a tax policy standpoint, or how you dispatch energy and how you kind of compensate operators that add complexity. And now you put a battery out there, and you have to decide every minute of the day, am I charging or discharging? Mm-hmm. And now, by the way, and that's complicated enough now. Play that forward 5 and 10 years from now as you deploy more and more of this stuff. That's a really hard thing to drive. And so one of the things I'm really excited, we're doing a lot of really cool work at the Research Center on this problem, which is just how do you make those assets really easy to operate profitably for their owners? How do you take a lot of that complexity away? And we think at the end of the day, that might be actually the most important differentiation in the space. Might not be the hardware you put out there, but the software layer that you put on top. And then the final thing I'll mention that kind of excites me and a lot of us in GE is the electrification trends that are going on. Certainly a lot of folks talking about EVs and whatnot. That's a really exciting space, especially when you look at fleets. One small thing that I'm working on that is taking up way too much of my nights and weekends is the electrification of agriculture. It's a very fascinating space. Food is a market that has built-in secular growth over the next 100 years because we keep making more people. They like eating. It turns out. And it uses a lot of energy, right? And so there's some pretty fascinating things around the electrification of agriculture and that I've been personally digging into that kind of have me daydreaming at night.
Dan, before I get to you on this, so you've raised a really interesting point. So for example, and how this plays with other sort of policy issues. So if you think about this, had this been happening before Waxman-Markey, right, when they were trying to figure out a cap and trade to address greenhouse gases, what kind of conversation would we have had then? And so, and I know that a lot of people would have liked to have seen climate legislation go through the Hill, but I kind of look at this, after listening to your remark, that had we actually had that cap and trade, what kind of market distortion or what kind of distortion would we have locked into place with sort of the federal government blessing, right, which would have impeded the kind of technology advances that you're talking about. Anyway, great topic, Dan.
Well, that in and of itself could be quite a discussion. I think I'm gonna leave that one there for a moment.
I was going to say, Dan might explode.
As Dave said, keep eating. That's good for GE, as we learned in the agriculture market. So two things I want to say. One, I now have the great pleasure of teaching courses in both early stage energy technology to engineering, law, and business students, and then a later stage course about how you go out and develop and finance an energy project. And the thing that I always stress to these graduate students is if you want to go into the energy technology business, you've got to think about a triangle of technology, policy, and finance. Technology is the top of the triangle, and policy and finance are the 2 points on the bottom, and they are designed to drive technology, to drive development, to drive deployment. And so many folks in Silicon Valley, where I work, in the energy technology area stumble because they have in fact developed a really smart technology. It can do lots of good, but what they run into are barriers on the policy side and huge difficulties raising capital from very early stage to long-term capital for financing projects. And it was very instructive being at Google where, they said, we're going to get into the energy area. We are really good at information technology. We ought to be good at energy technology. And I think what we discovered in my time there is that energy technology in many ways is a lot harder. It takes a lot more time. Instead of measuring in months or years, we often measure things in decades. And instead of measuring costs of a particular project in the millions or tens of millions, we often measure things in the billions or tens of billions. Mm-hmm. So much longer time frames, much greater capital costs along the whole development pathway. So that's part of the reason Google pulled back some, learning this pretty tough lesson. So technology, policy, and finance. My quick thoughts, again, if you want to start with technology, I think we really do, no matter which technology area you're in, really have to take account of where we stand with the policy arena and that in many ways driving capital flows or not. So solar and wind. The tax credits for wind are phasing out over the next couple of years. Solar, they will be with us, but then fall off a cliff down to 10% for only one portion of solar technology. That's a huge policy driver. Carbon capture, we haven't spoken much about that here, but we have a brand new, fairly high-level tax credit that's been put in place for carbon capture, and that's stimulating a lot of new interest. On the other hand, there's all sorts of regulatory issues. When you capture the CO2, there are restrictions on where you can put it and all the testing you have to do to make sure it stays there. So incentives and regulation. Offshore wind, both fixed bottom and this whole new emerging area specifically or more generally in the Pacific Rim, which are these floating systems. Lots of money flowing in that direction, but a variety of permitting issues in getting these projects built on both coasts of the United States and other parts of the world. Our biggest low-carbon electricity source to this day is hydropower. We don't talk much about hydro, but it is number one. And it's got a whole set of opportunities in terms of emerging advanced technologies, but it's got a whole set of problems over what it can do to natural systems. Some of those, I think, are being worked out, and I think hydro actually has a very interesting future. It does provide something that looks more like base load than solar and wind. And whether it's the way you manage reservoirs, as we are thinking about more and more in California, trying to integrate solar and wind, or the re-emerging area of pumped storage. It's well in excess of 90% of all of our electricity storage in the United States is from pump storage. We have 8 pump storage projects now pending in California. Not all of them will get built. Part of the reason they won't get built is because there are very difficult permitting problems in getting a pump storage project built. But if they get built, they can add an important new element to all of this. We've talked about nuclear, huge range of policy issues in the nuclear context, the regulatory issues. That's sort of how I cut my teeth early in the energy world. But those are extraordinarily important, whether it's in this country or in many others. And lastly, I think what gets ignored more than anything else, and I was glad to see one presentation, which is plain old-fashioned boring energy efficiency. People talk about energy efficiency as low-hanging fruit. I talk about it as low-hanging fruit that grows back, because we're always inventing new energy efficiency technologies, as we saw here today. But it has its own set of incentive issues and regulatory issues. So again, every one of these technologies, you tell any of the 4 of us what you're interested in, and we will tell you both how to think about incentives and the regulatory barriers to getting something done.
I want to just jump in on something to connect the dots as what Dave said too. And I want to be clear in that obviously we're still not ready for, in my humble opinion, we're still not ready for comprehensive energy policy for some of the reasons Dave brought up as well. And we have a long history of trying to do that. To Dan's point and to my earlier point, what I don't think is realized is there is so much opportunity for incremental surgical policy change that does not cost a significant amount of money and is like there are very high levels of success on. So in that, speaking with my lobbyist hat, I lobby in limited circumstances, but I work for a big lobby shop, and I cannot tell you how much gets done. And even one of the foundations that Dave and I work with the other day, one of the gentlemen behind the foundation, who's very wealthy, was like, man, I can't believe how much we were able to save in GHG emissions just with the carbon tax that was just with the CCS tax that was passed last year.
Incentive, yep.
The incentives. So the point is just don't shy. I think there's been a long history of shying away from moving policy in your favor, and we have an opportunity in a market that's accepting of these incremental policy changes.
I'll give you one very quick example. We've built a lot of these energy technologies in the United States around tax credits. That's been sort of one of the instruments. Tax credits have real drawbacks. They turn out to be a relatively inefficient way of incentivizing a technology. If you look at the oil and gas industry in the United States, particularly building oil and gas pipelines, they have been incentivized by a technique that was authorized in the 1980s by the federal government called master limited partnerships. They have lots of advantages from a financial standpoint. And a few years ago, we and others said, why don't we open up master limited partnerships to technologies beyond oil and gas? That legislation is pending. It's got strong bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. And it's a simple tweak, but it would open up what I would argue is a more efficient way of incentivizing the whole rest of the group of energy technologies. So it's surgical, and I think that's the right word, surgical changes you can make, often getting bipartisan support, which comes as a surprise to many.
Right.
Not that
So, by the way, I totally agree with you. On the tax credit side, so I'm torn. So tax credits can be good up to a certain point, but tax credits, they're hard to get rid of, right? And then they lock in.
Hard to get rid of politically, you mean?
Yes, yes. Hard to get rid of politically. And then it ends up creating these special interest classes that want to protect sort of existing technology that then becomes antiquated and then becomes a barrier to sort of new technology development and deployment, right? So it's a tough issue. It's complicated. But on nuclear, though, so you talk about the regulatory barriers to nuclear. Can nuclear power ever really be competitive in the U.S., right? Particularly if you're looking at the disruptive technologies and what's happening with the power grid.
Can new nuclear? Can existing nuclear?
Let's say new nuclear.
I think we'll see. I think there's a lot more innovation going on in the nuclear area than I realized up till a few years ago, and I started to dig into it. So I think there is a lot of innovation. We do have models in other parts of the world. South Korea was mentioned, where you can actually build this stuff at fairly cost-competitive ways. If your question is, in the U.S., can it be competitive? I think that's a really serious, open question, because we do have a more complicated system. So I think technologically, there's all sorts of progress that can be made in the nuclear area. I think the question becomes, can we make the adjustments to our regulatory and incentive systems that will kind of give nuclear, the boost that I think folks in the nuclear industry want? And I think that's very much an open question.
Thoughts from you guys?
Do you want to comment on nuclear?
I don't have a lot that I'd say about the nuclear business. It's as a technologist, I think you're always a little bit unwise to count out the innovative spirit of the technical communities, especially in the United States. And it makes it hard to predict which mode of energy production is the next one that will see that next swing. You can look back over the last decade and look at some of the incredible shifts in energy technology, and I defy you to find people who really saw that coming.
Right,
Whether it was
right.
unconventional oil and gas, I can tell you we're big in the oil and gas space, and we're bullish on it, and we didn't see that coming the way it did.
Right.
Whether you look at the incredible deflation in solar, right? There weren't a lot of people that predicted that was going to happen when it did. And we heard that in a lot of the talks yesterday as well. So I just never like betting against the technical community, especially in this country, to be able to innovate.
Great.
I would recommend a report. When I was on the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board up until the end of the Obama administration, and Secretary Moniz asked the advisory board to do a report on the future of nuclear energy in the United States. The question that was posed essentially was, could we get to building 5 gigawatts, 5,000 megawatts a year by 2030 of new nuclear in the United States, and what it would take? I recommend the report to you. It's a daunting but not impossible task.
And I think I don't work as close with the nuclear projects and companies as I do in a lot of other sectors, but I do work with many groups that are very pro-nuclear and very excited about the future of nuclear. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there that the rest of the world is very excited about as well. And this takes us to a point that we haven't really discussed, which is innovation and U.S. leadership in innovation and the importance of it. And I think when it comes to nuclear, that's what's most important about nuclear is and I say advanced nuclear, definitely advanced nuclear. I think that is what's most important about advanced nuclear is the appetite that the rest of the world has to commercialize this as well. And the one thing I'll say before I turn it back, I am, as people can probably tell, and you can tell we have a very bipartisan panel here, but I am 100% all of the above. And at the end of the day, nuclear plays an important role to zero emissions. So I completely understand the advancement. But I do think, and this was a conversation that got brought up last night as well, the beyond lithium and battery discussion is really where we have a huge opportunity as a country right now. And this goes to the issue really in full commercialization of batteries right now and full deployment is the finance question. And that's really, that's where I think nuclear plays a role, but that's where I see a really important leadership role for the US that I hope we can all come together and take advantage of. So the same type of thing doesn't happen, because I will say I'm seeing it, and the other thing we'll bring up is China, but I'm seeing it a lot with homegrown battery technologies receive funding from China and not really be able to obtain funding from US companies. So, and we're seeing more interaction in it, but the bottom line is just that there's a lot of opportunity that I hope is realized. And that aligns with nuclear, but that's what I think is more important now. I think nuclear will be important in the next decade.
Dan, you got some thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think the China question is a really important one.
I know I brought up a lot in one.
The Energy Department asked us to do a report on the Chinese solar industry, which we issued last year. How is it that it's grown to be so significant? How is it that it's dominated global solar, a technology, as many of you know, that was invented here in the United States in the early 50s and that the US federal government has been investing in for decades? So we all know that China has become the leading manufacturer of solar panels in the world. It's 70% or so of the world market. Mm-hmm. But just in the last few years, it's become the biggest domestic deployer of solar, which has driven a lot of its growth. But the most interesting thing, and I think the biggest challenge, is the Chinese have gotten very good at solar R&D. They've not only put money into solar R&D, they've learned from their mistakes in their overall approach to R&D. Solar has ended up as a real key element of the 13th five-year plan in China, as has the broader world of clean energy. The Chinese have basically, I think, set about in a pretty organized way, very well-funded way, to dominate most of these clean energy technologies that we're hearing about today. And I think in our own country, we are taking a pretty disorganized approach to the same opportunity. And I think year by year, piece by piece, we are losing much of our lead. And again, these are technologies that our taxpayers have paid for many, many decades.
But Dave, I think Dave's perspective is interesting on this. Where are you in terms of commercialization near term and to essentially coming out of the White House? What do you think the opportunities for this group are? We know nuclear is a little. I think we're in agreement that nuclear is a little further out, but there's a lot of potential. But where do you see the opportunities, and where do you think folks like this and of course, you're on the technology innovation side, but as we're discussing, the policy is important as well.
Well, at least from this administration's perspective, there is a lot of support for the advanced nuclear piece, right? Because there's a recognition that the U.S. has lost a competitive advantage in light water reactor technologies. If the U.S. is ever going to have a civil nuclear program, a vibrant one, it needs to focus on the advanced technology piece. Having said that, right, it's complicated because if you take Bill Gates' example, right, where he's got a prototype reactor that he's building in China.
Right.
So and this goes back to your point, and it's really troublesome. And we actually talked about this in the whole sort of solar tariff discussion, right? Putting the trade people aside, the trade people just want to talk about, how low or how high a tariff is, right? But from a sort of an energy economic policy, the first question that we had amongst ourselves, the domestic and international people, was, is solar a strategic industry? And it was pretty obvious. Yeah, of course it is, right? And so therefore, how should the U.S. government play in this space? What kind of steps should the U.S. government take to develop a competitive advantage, right, in a certain solar technology, and what should the trade policy be in order to protect that advantage later on? Because we've seen over and over and over again, the innovation happens here, it's commercialized elsewhere, and back to one of your other points, at some point the innovation dries up here, right? And so that's a very troublesome thing, and people are trying to think through that. I think that, again, it's tough. Going back to my opening remarks, it's tough to figure out what the future looks like when it comes to technology. We were just talking about the power markets. How are the power markets going to look in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? I mean, we certainly know that the existing utility model is being swept away, right? But what does it look like? And so, from an administration perspective, sort of to wrap up the answer to your question. So the advanced nuclear piece, there is a lot of interest in the storage, right, and some of these disruptive technologies that make renewables more competitive, right? But then I think for political reasons, and also I think there is an appreciation that there's regardless of who of the current administration, at some point, coal and natural gas are going to need carbon capture, utilization, CCUS, right, in order to help guarantee their survival. So there's a lot of support for CCUS.
And I think what this shows is that technology commercialization is bipartisan, and U.S. innovation, U.S. leadership is bipartisan. We just need, again, I think the other theme is surgical solutions.
We have our pet projects,
Yep.
right? We have our pet projects, but so in sort of ordering these things, and I'll share this with the group. We were looking at those 3 buckets of technologies. It was nuclear, storage, and then carbon capture. So I think maybe some Democrats would have thought the carbon capture would have been a greater priority than the renewable piece. But again, there's a recognition that with all this generation of the capacity that's being put on the grid, wind and solar, you need to figure out how to make it work in the future grid.
I just to be candid though, we have had these differences of opinion over the funding of some key programs. ARPA-E was in very big trouble with the original OMB budget. The loan program, which is really our biggest large chunk of capital for commercializing technology, was in some trouble. I think things look much better now. Bipartisan response on Capitol Hill, lots of hard work by Taite and others. Both of those, are back in better shape. But we do have some differences of opinion, to be very honest, between this administration and, frankly, both Republicans and Democrats on the Hill over what he ought to do for commercialization.
But you know what? I'm not sure how real that ARPA-E position was. Right?
I know the loan program was.
Loan program was real.
Was very
RPE
real.
Well,
what at points?
although Secretary Perry, huge,
No. I said
defender.
OMB. I did not say DOE. I think the biggest difference may well be between DOE and OMB
So
in this administration.
so just to give a little insight on this, by the way.
Sorry, we got political for a second.
Sorry.
Poor
Todd.
Look, I fought this stuff.
I know.
Right? Because, I came in, big believer in the energy innovation program and programs, kind of across the board. And I show up in the job and I've got this budget that was written by, some of a particular, conservative think tank. That
Shall not be named.
And I kind of looked at it and I was like, how do they come up with these numbers? Anyway, that's probably another conversation elsewhere, probably at a bar. But anyway, so we're all kind of we're kind of stuck with this because it became the baseline, and then over the course of the year, when things would come up, certain energy technology programs, we would have to fight over it, right? Because I would look at it, OMB would say, well, this is policy that we're getting rid of this. I'm like, no, it's not. I was like, this was a budget that you guys dropped down on the table without a policy-making process. So, you're right. So there is a difference between the OMBs, but I'm not sure how much difference there is between the energy policy
That's
people
I think
across the
I think
administration.
that's fair.
Right?
It's just you got some budget cutters inside of OMB and with some
Yes.
I think you have
philosophical-
favorite projects. I think that's the best way. But overall commercialization, I was asked this question this morning on really where I focus now. I've done a lot of work in earlier stage, but where I focus now is the last valley of death and that final commercialization. Just because I've seen so many good companies not make it at that last stage of funding. And somebody asked me this morning, well, it's hard because Democrats aren't supportive of some of the other zero carbon technology. And I said, that's what's good about the commercialization. At the end of the day, you have both sides of the aisle will come together on the need for commercialization. Of course, we don't want the government to impede what the private sector will do. That's
Right.
very, very important. And that's why we need smaller surgical policy. We'll keep with that theme. But we don't want to impede the private sector from deploying capital. We want to enable the private sector to deploy capital.
So on that point, what are the bigger barriers, the top three barriers? If you can think of...
The top three barriers to commercialization,
Right.
Overall. Well, and this is what I opened up with. So it is strategy.
But I mean, from a government
Yeah.
perspective.
From a government perspective.
Yeah.
Just the program's not being flexible enough in a way that, and I've sat down with the unnamed think tank and had these arguments with the unnamed think tank. You can imagine they didn't go that well, but I got a lot of information out of it that was helpful. And when I said overcoming obstacles to drive innovation from a U.S. perspective is not a liberal perspective. That's actually well received by a lot of moderate conservatives. Mm-hmm. They said, no, it's not. We only want R&D. And I said, okay, that's not what I'm hearing from a lot of others. So that's the disconnect. And as soon as you break it down that you're not going to prohibit private capital from coming in. And so right now we need a more flexible program. We need a more flexible program that enables more private sector capital to come in and doesn't require the choice government or private sector. We need tools in the middle.
Great.
And that's a lot of the work I'm excited about over the next 2 years.
Great. Todd, do you have any?
Yeah, I do. And by the way, being on this panel makes me appreciate how peaceful it is living in upstate New York compared to living inside the Beltway. But look, the way I think of this when it comes to energy, energy is a macroeconomic thing. And at the end of the day, what you need for an economy and for a country and for society is energy to be cheap. Our standard of living here in this country is because of the embarrassment of riches that we've enjoyed. At least one of the contributors is the embarrassment of riches we've enjoyed in having the lowest cost energy on the planet. And that frees up a lot of things. So when I look at government policies, it definitely plays a role in a lot of energy technology development and whatnot. My view is it always has to be viewed as a temporary thing. At the end of the day,
Right.
Yep.
at the end of the day, what you want to emerge is the most competitive technology. That always means always the lowest cost thing. That's what makes economies good and strong and whatnot. So when we're evaluating new technologies, and my encouragement to people when they're in the very earliest stages of technology development, you have to convince yourself that at some point in the maturity of that technology, it has the possibility of really getting to a price point where the world is just going to want it, no matter what
matter
you
what.
do in D.C.
Right.
The world is going to want that thing because that thing is better than what we have. You know, somebody yesterday used the famous quote we've all heard a million times. I always love it. The Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones, right? And that's a great way of, I think, encapsulating where this all ultimately needs to go. So, if you go and put policies in place to support a technology that is an ultimate loser, that was a stupid thing to do. That is a stupid thing to do. We've got to always have that line of sight that says, yes, this will eventually win, and those are the only ones
Right.
that we ought to support.
With
Right.
unexpected developments, though.
Yes.
That's what's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd say
Yeah.
lowest cost, yes, but we got to take a sophisticated view of cost. You know, we got to make sure that that technology is advanced in a way that meets reliability issues in the grid, really meets resilience issues, meets carbon requirements and all that. So there's a lot that goes into actually determining what the right way to look at costs is. So I work for this wind technology company, and we developed, actually with some support from the federal government and the R&D side, a gearless, direct drive, permanent magnet wind turbine, 2 megawatts, and actually raised enough money to get 2 of these units built. They operated well. We had some data, but got stuck in the valley of death. The valley of death in that case was we went out to the project finance community, and they say, wow, that's an interesting turbine. How many turbine years do you have? And we said, we have 2 turbine years. We ran 1 turbine for a year, and we ran the other turbine for a year. They said, come back when you have 100 turbine years. That's, 50 more years of running 2 turbines. We couldn't afford to build any more of these to prove it out. And we had a big competitor in General Electric with General Electric's 2 megawatt turbine, but we thought we had a better turbine. Struggled. 10 years later, finally found someone in Brazil who agreed to put up a 200 megawatt project. So it's really long. It's really tough. What helps? The loan program is a good example of something that can help. Buy down the risk in providing a debt for a project. The government assumes some of that risk, either in a loan or a loan guarantee. Federal procurement. The largest single buyer of electricity on the planet is the U.S. federal government. Tens of billions of dollars we spend every year. Whether it's the Obama administration or this administration, we have not been doing a good enough job in buying the output of innovative technologies that we want to advance. The federal government can provide power purchase agreements. So there's innumerable ways that we can do a better job of commercializing technologies.
Interesting. So we're going to get the hook here in
We
about,
need to hear your 30 seconds before we stop.
well, hold on. I'm Southern, so I need more than 30 seconds. But just final thoughts, though. 15 seconds apiece.
I'm just really excited about the future, but you have to be strategic, you have to be smart, and you have to look at your internally and externally.
We talked a little bit about how clean tech hasn't been quite as easy innovation space as IT tech has been over the last couple of decades. And one thing to keep in mind for all of our innovators here is you got to look 2 levels higher into the ecosystem as to where you plug in. It's easy as a scientist, and I've been there too, where you love your science bit, but you need to draw a picture and do the math 2 levels higher in the system as to what your thing really looks like when it's plugged into the energy ecosystem, and how is it better than the incumbent. And often that is the most insightful thing that you can do that'll guide where you go with your technology and let you know whether you have a shot at winning or not.
Technology, policy, finance. If you're a technology, you're at the top of that triangle, no doubt, but you've got to get smart about those other 2 points of the triangle, because they will eat you alive if you don't make progress. And that's how most of these energy technologies die, is not having taken account of those other 2 points of the triangle.
Thanks. So, this has been great. I think it's been a fun conversation.
Fun.
Now I'm a little biased since I'm up here, but
And you're the moderator.
but I'm certainly walking away feeling better about things. You know, so it's always good to hang out with my, you know, Democratic colleagues, right? So few takeaways from me. Good bipartisan support for the innovation agenda in general. We may differ, you know, around the edges. Some of our colleagues may more than that. Certainly barriers to innovation. We need to think those through, and I think that's probably the most important policy discussion that the administration or the United States can actually have, right? We shouldn't be looking at how do we protect, and I'm a fan of nuclear, I've written about this. We shouldn't be focused on so much on how do we protect the existing fleet or the existing system. We should be looking at how do we develop a competitive advantage, how do we prepare for the future, and how do we get some of the stuff back from China, right? How do we keep Bill Gates here, right? And then the third point is that people like to eat, and we are about to eat our lunch now. So it's been great. It's been terrific. Thank you all.
Well done.
Thank you guys for volunteering your time and being here. I think it gave a different perspective for everybody in this room to really focus on, one, the technology, two, the finance, but also the policy side. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.